When 17-year-old Melissa Chen walked onto the Family Feud stage with her golden retriever guide dog, Hero, the studio fell into respectful silence. But it wasn't her partial blindness that would stop the show. It was what Steve Harvey learned about how she lost her sight that changed everything. Melissa moved with quiet confidence across the stage, her left hand resting lightly on Hero's harness, her right hand extended to feel for the podium. Her family formed a protective circle around her, not because she needed protection, but because they had learned over the past 2 years that the world wasn't always kind to heroes who bore visible scars from their heroism. The Chen family had driven 12 hours from Riverside, California, for their chance at Family Feud. There was David Chen, 48, a software engineer who had taken early retirement to help his daughter navigate her new reality. His wife, Susan, 45, a former emergency room nurse who now devoted her time to supporting families of trauma survivors. Their older son, Kevin, 20, home from college where he was studying to become a counselor, inspired by watching his sister's recovery. And then there was Melissa herself, 17 years old, a senior at Riverside High School, honor student, former varsity soccer player, and the girl who had saved 23 of her classmates during the worst school shooting in California history. The shooting at Jefferson High School had happened 18 months earlier. Melissa had been in the library when the gunman entered the building. Instead of hiding, instead of running, she had made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She had stood up, gathered every student she could find, and led them to safety through a route she knew by heart from her years of soccer practice, a path that took them behind the gymnasium and away from the main buildings. She had made 3 trips back into the danger zone, each time guiding more students to safety. On her final trip, as she was helping evacuate the computer lab, a stray bullet had shattered a window. The glass fragments had destroyed the vision in her left eye and severely damaged her right eye, leaving her with only partial sight that continued to deteriorate. 23 students had gone home to their families that day because of Melissa's courage, but she had paid a price that would follow her for the rest of her life. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Kevin's idea. Mel, he had told his sister during one of her darker moments, "You've spent the last year and a half thinking about what you lost. Maybe it's time to think about what you still have: family, courage, and a story that could inspire millions of people." Melissa had been hesitant. Public appearances were challenging now. The constant questions about her vision, the stares, the whispered conversations about that girl from the shooting, all of it was overwhelming for someone who was still processing her own trauma while trying to finish high school and plan for a future that looked completely different from what she had imagined. But Hero had changed everything. The golden retriever had been specially trained, not just as a guide dog, but as an emotional support animal for trauma survivors. He could sense Melissa's panic attacks before they began, could guide her away from crowds when she felt overwhelmed, could provide the steady, reassuring presence that helped her face each day. Steve Harvey had been immediately struck by the family during rehearsal. There was something about Melissa's quiet strength, the way she moved with Hero, the obvious love and pride her family felt for her, that set them apart from typical contestants. When he had knelt down to pet Hero during the family introductions, the dog had remained perfectly still, professionally focused on his job. "This is Hero," Melissa had said simply when Steve asked about her companion. "He helps me see what I need to see." "Hero," Steve had repeated, testing the name. "That's a strong name for a dog." "We thought it was appropriate," Melissa had replied with a small smile that suggested there was more to the story. The game had progressed normally through the first 3 rounds. The Chen family was competing against the Williams family from Texas, and both teams were evenly matched. Melissa had contributed solid answers, her responses thoughtful and mature beyond her 17 years. When asked to name something that helps you get through difficult times, she had confidently answered, "Faith," earning the number 2 spot on the board. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The question was one that seemed designed for inspiration. Name something that makes you see clearly. The Williams family had just missed their opportunity to control the board, and it was the Chen family's chance to steal. David had given the first answer, experience, which had earned a respectable spot. Susan had followed with love, Another solid response. Now it was Melissa's turn. Melissa stepped forward to the podium, Hero moving seamlessly beside her, his golden coat catching the studio lights. For a moment she was quiet, and Steve could see her considering not just the survey question, but something deeper. When she spoke, her voice carried across the studio with a clarity that made everyone listen. My dog shows me what I can't see. The words hung in the air with a weight that went far beyond a game show answer. But Steve sensed there was more to this response than met the eye. Something about the way she had said it, the careful precision of her phrasing, suggested layers of meaning he didn't yet understand. Melissa, Steve said gently, setting down his cards and approaching her. That's a beautiful answer. Tell me about Hero. Melissa's hand moved to rest on Hero's head, and the dog looked up at her with the kind of devotion that spoke of a bond forged through shared challenges. Hero isn't just my guide dog, Melissa said quietly. He's my reminder that I can still help people, even when I can't see everything clearly myself. Steve nodded, but he sensed there was still more to the story. Can I ask you something, Melissa? And if it's too personal, you don't have to answer. But how did you lose your vision? The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't the polite quiet of people waiting for a game show reveal, but the profound silence of individuals who sensed they were about to hear something important. Melissa looked toward her family, drawing strength from their presence, then back at Steve. Hero pressed closer to her leg, sensing her emotional state and providing the steady support he had been trained to give. I was at school, she said simply. There was a shooting. I helped some other students get to safety, and I got hurt in the process. The words were matter of fact, delivered without drama or self-pity, but their impact on the studio was immediate and profound. Steve's expression changed completely, the entertainer's smile replaced by something much more serious. Melissa, Steve said softly, how many students did you help? 23, she replied, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly. But I couldn't help everyone. 7 students and 2 teachers didn't make it home that day. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 audience members held their breath. The Williams family, their competitors, watched with tears forming in their eyes. Even the production crew had stopped their usual bustling activity. Steve Harvey had interviewed countless people, had heard stories of tragedy and triumph, but something about this 17-year-old girl, her quiet courage, her obvious guilt over the people she couldn't save, her determination to find meaning in her loss, stopped him completely. Melissa, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved 23 people. 23 families have their children because of what you did. But 9 people died, Melissa replied, the words coming out like a confession she'd been carrying for 18 months. 9 people who might still be alive if I had been faster, or smarter, or braver. Steve looked at this teenage girl who was carrying a burden no 17-year-old should ever have to bear, who had sacrificed her vision to save others, and was now living with survivor's guilt that seemed to weigh more than her small frame could handle. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Stop the game, Steve called out to the production booth, his voice carrying across the studio with quiet authority. We're taking a moment here. The cameras kept rolling, but the competition stopped. Steve walked around the podium and approached Melissa with the same respect he would show a decorated veteran. Melissa, he said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You didn't lose your sight in an accident. You didn't lose it to disease. You lost it because you chose to save other people's lives. That doesn't make you a victim. That makes you a hero. Melissa shook her head, tears beginning to flow. Heroes don't let people die. Heroes save everyone. No, baby, Steve said gently, kneeling down so he could look directly into her remaining eye. Heroes do the best they can with what they have in impossible situations, and they live with the consequences. Heroes make split-second decisions that save lives, even when they can't save every life. Hero sensed Melissa's distress and moved closer, pressing his body against her legs in the way he had been trained to provide comfort during emotional episodes. Steve noticed the dog's response and was struck by the intelligence and compassion in the animal's behavior. Can I ask you about Hero's name? Steve said. Was that name chosen specifically for you? My family named him, Melissa replied, wiping her eyes. They said that heroes take care of each other, and that he would take care of me the way I took care of other people. Steve looked at this remarkable girl and her remarkable dog, seeing a partnership that went beyond typical guide dog relationships. This was a team built around mutual care, shared purpose, and the recognition that strength comes in many forms. Melissa, Steve said, standing up and addressing not just her but the entire studio, I want everyone here to understand something. This young woman didn't just answer a survey question about seeing clearly, she just taught us what real vision looks like. He turned to address the audience directly. Vision isn't about what your eyes can see, it's about what your heart can see. And Melissa's heart saw 23 students who needed help, and she acted on that vision even when it cost her everything. The audience began to react, not with the usual game show applause, but with something deeper. Recognition of genuine heroism, acknowledgement of sacrifice, the kind of respect reserved for people who have given everything for others. But Steve wasn't finished. Melissa, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I want to give you something, not because you need anything from me, but because I want you to have a reminder of what I learned from you today. He pulled out his business card and handed it to her, but then he did something unprecedented. He began to remove his suit jacket, the same navy blue jacket he wore for every taping. This jacket has been with me for thousands of shows, Steve said, draping it gently around Melissa's shoulders. It's seen families win and lose, laugh and cry, come together and fall apart. But today it's being worn by someone who understands what it really means to sacrifice for others. The jacket was far too large for Melissa's small frame, but she wore it with the dignity of someone receiving a Medal of Honor. Hero looked up at her, tail wagging slightly, sensing that something important was happening. But I want to do something else, Steve continued. He knelt down beside Hero, looking directly at the golden retriever who had been watching the entire interaction with intelligent, caring eyes. Hero, Steve said seriously, as if addressing a fellow human being, thank you for taking care of her. Thank you for helping her see what she needs to see. You're doing important work, boy. Hero's tail wagged more enthusiastically, and he looked between Steve and Melissa as if understanding that he was being recognized for his service. Steve stood up and turned to the Chen family. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Kevin, I want you to know that you raised someone extraordinary, not because of what happened to her, but because of who she chose to be when it mattered most. David Chen was openly crying now, the kind of tears that come from watching someone finally recognize your child's heroism instead of just her tragedy. She never talks about what she did, he managed to say. She only talks about the people she couldn't save. That's because real heroes focus on what they didn't do instead of celebrating what they did do, Steve replied. But today we're going to celebrate what she did do. 23 families, 23 young people who are alive today because your daughter chose courage over safety. He turned back to Melissa. And I want you to remember something. Every time you feel that guilt, every time you think about the people you couldn't save, those 23 students, they're living their lives right now because of you. They're graduating, going to college, falling in love, starting families, pursuing dreams, all because you saw what needed to be done and you did it. Melissa was crying now, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of guilt or sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally allowing herself to accept that her sacrifice had meaning. Can I tell you something else? Steve said gently. Every time Hero guides you somewhere safe, every time he helps you navigate the world, he's continuing your work. You saved people by leading them to safety, and now he saves you by leading you to safety. You're both heroes, just in different ways. The studio erupted in sustained applause, but this time it was different from any game show ovation Steve had ever heard. It was the sound of people honoring genuine heroism, recognizing sacrifice, acknowledging that sometimes the most profound moments happen when tragedy reveals the very best of human nature. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something remarkable happened. Person after person approached Melissa, not to ask about the shooting or her injury, but to thank her. Parents whose children attended Jefferson High, teachers from other schools, first responders who understood the split-second decisions that define heroism. One elderly veteran approached with tears in his eyes. "Young lady," he said, "I served in Vietnam, and I want you to know that what you did took more courage than anything I ever did in combat. Thank you for your service." 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional weight of Melissa's story or Steve's unprecedented response. The impact was immediate and profound. Schools across the country used the clip in discussions about heroism, courage, and how communities respond to tragedy. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the families of the 23 students Melissa had saved. They organized a surprise visit to the studio where the episode was filmed, creating a reunion that brought together a hero and the people whose lives she had changed forever. Melissa graduated as valedictorian of her class, her speech focusing not on her own experience but on the importance of community, courage, and the healing power of service to others. She kept Steve's jacket as a reminder that her story mattered, that her sacrifice was seen and honored. She went on to study social work, specializing in trauma recovery and crisis intervention. Hero remained her constant companion throughout college, helping her navigate both the physical challenges of her visual impairment and the emotional challenges of her survivor's guilt. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that meeting Melissa changed his understanding of heroism and vision. "She taught me that the most important things we see aren't seen with our eyes," he said. "They're seen with our hearts, our courage, our willingness to act when action is needed." The business card Steve gave her that day led to a lasting friendship and mentorship. When Melissa established a foundation to support families affected by school violence, Steve became one of its first major supporters. Hero lived to be 14, spending his entire working life helping Melissa navigate the world with confidence and grace. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, hundreds of people attended his memorial service. Students whose lives Melissa had saved, families who had been touched by her story, and community members who understood that Hero's service had been just as important as his partner's heroism. The lesson that day wasn't just about one teenager's courage in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It was about how heroes are made, not by supernatural strength or fearless bravery, but by ordinary people who choose to act when action is needed, who sacrifice for others even when the cost is enormous, who carry the weight of their choices with grace and humility. Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most profound television happens when you stop entertaining and start honoring. When you recognize that some stories are bigger than games or prizes, when you understand that real vision comes not from what we can see but from what we choose to do with what we see. And Melissa Chen proved that heroism isn't about being invincible. It's about being vulnerable, making impossible choices, living with the consequences, and finding ways to continue serving others, even when service has cost you everything you thought you needed to serve effectively. The partnership between Melissa and Hero became a symbol of how healing happens, not through forgetting trauma but through finding new ways to help others, new forms of courage, new definitions of what it means to see clearly in a world that often seems impossibly dark.